the Community Action Partnership, and welcome to our Monday video supported by our Organizational Standards Center of Excellence on Community Action Agency Board Recruitment and Development. We'll start out with a couple of housekeeping items, and then we'll jump into today's webinar. So at the top, this webinar is being recorded. We usually post the webinar recordings along with the slides no later than a couple of days after the webinar airs, so you can access that, both the video recording and the slides. So look for that on the partnership website. And we also make all of our other training videos available as well. So just a reminder to check back frequently. We usually have a number of webinars every week, so we are constantly putting out new resources, new support for our agencies. Secondly, if you have questions during the webinar, I will stop at various times, and you can enter in your questions into the chat window, and I'll stop to take questions in the order that they're answered. And of course, I'm always happy to follow up with our agencies offline if you have a longer question, or if there's anything else that you need support with related to this webinar or any of the other training and technical assistance that the partnership offers. Also a reminder that this is the first webinar in a 3-webinar series. We have the next 2 over the next couple of Mondays. And again, this is a focus on overall board development and board governance issues. So with that said, let's go ahead and get going. The recording is started, so we are going to jump into the content. So today's agenda is relatively straightforward. We are focusing on sort of the initial recruitment and development of a community action agency board. So we'll take a deeper dive into how to make sure that you are assessing the needs of your board, who should you be recruiting. We'll talk about some basic recruiting strategies, and also make sure that you know of a variety of different resources available from both the partnership and our other national partner, CAAs, to help you as you conduct board recruiting and build the capacity of your boards, especially for new board members. So again, just a reminder that board issues in general is a high priority training and technical assistance need. There are a wide variety of the organizational standards that are connected to how you as community action agencies work with your boards. So it's a particularly important area of focus, not just for the standard, but also for the broader health and good governance of your community action agencies. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to profile boards on this webinar series. And of course, I'm always available if you need additional questions answered or would like additional support with how you work with your community action boards. So to begin with, I want to make sure that everybody is aware of key resources that are available from the Community Action Partnership and CAAs to help you with board engagement and development. So at the very top of the list, we have worked with CAAs through our Organizational Standards Center of Excellence to develop a new set of board training resources that's really intended for not just our state associations, but also our agencies to provide those tools to help you conduct good board training. So if you go to CAA's website, it is one of the featured web resources that is up there at the very top of the CAA's web page. And you want to follow the link to the training and orientation tool for tripartite boards. And what we've done is created an overall slide deck. I think there are almost 130 slides, but those are broken out into different components, different topics, and they are intended to provide a comprehensive resource, sort of a common library, if you will, for our agencies and our state associations who are doing board training. So we would encourage all of you to take a look at those resources. These are heavily annotated slides, so they're really intended to be used at the agency level as you do your board training. And so what we're hoping is to create sort of that common source of board training resources on those high priority issues like board roles and responsibilities, and related issues, how boards review and work with financial information, how you recruit and develop your board. So all of those particular issues are addressed in these board training resources. And so we would encourage you to take a look as an agency at those resources, because we know a lot of our agencies do their board trainings themselves. So this is hopefully will ease the burden of having to develop your own resources, and also make sure that when you use these training slides, you know these were developed by CAAs. Again, these are extensively annotated, so they're also a good support for any staff who do board training or who work with your board. So we would encourage you to take a look at that, and also make sure that you incorporate these training slides into your regular board trainings. There's also another set of resources that's designed for you at the agency level to think through your board training needs, to look at what kind of training topics that you'll use, and to come up with your annual board training agenda, as it were. So there's a shorter slide deck that helps you go through and map out that process and the content of what you're going to train your board on for the upcoming year. So we're really trying to make this as easy as possible for our agencies, but would encourage you to go through that process, make sure that you're being intentional as you design your board training strategies about what topics you're training on and the materials that you use. And we'll go into a little bit more detail a little bit later on in the slides about what you might want to be focusing on in your board training. So take a look at those resources, and we will also be coming out with additional training resources working with CAAs. The ones that are up on the CAAs webpage are focused more on our nonprofit agencies, but we're also developing a slide deck for our public agencies as well. But our public agencies can use a variety of the resources that are up there. We just want you to know that we've got some specific resources for you in particular. The partnership has also is about to release a new training series called Roma for Boards. There are, I believe, 6 videos in this series. These are about 15 to 20-minute webinars where we go into more detail about what boards need to know about results-oriented management, the results-oriented management and accountability framework. So these are great tools for especially orienting new board members to what Roma means and how your agency should be using that performance management framework. But it's also great for boards to do a deeper dive looking at the board's role in performance management, making sure your board is aware of the Roma framework, how it's supposed to be used and how it functions in an agency. So just another set of resources that you'll hopefully find useful in building the capacity of your board to work with the results-oriented management and accountability framework. And that should be going up just within the next couple of days. We would encourage you to work with your Roma trainers to potentially do some training for your boards on that Roma framework. So again, just hopefully a resource to help shorten the time needed to get those resources out to your board, get them trained up on some of these high priority topics. So with that, I'll see if there are any questions about accessing those resources. Again, you can enter in any questions into the chat window. And if you have any challenges tracking down those resources on the partnership website, just let me know, and I can either send them to you or otherwise connect you to them. So we're seeing if there are any questions, and Courtney, it doesn't look like any have come through. So I will go ahead and talk about strategically recruiting board members. So again, this webinar is focused on sort of the initial process of recruiting board members and then developing them as you get them seated. So the slide that you're looking at right now goes through the elements of effective recruitment. So one of the things that we're hoping that you do listening to this webinar at home is think through the process that your agency uses when it strategically thinks about who you're trying to get on the board. And so at the very top is the needs of your agency and how you're filling those needs on your board. So, of course, there is the tripartite structure. That's one of the most important needs, making sure that your board is in compliance with the requirements of the CSBG Act when it comes to seating the three different legs, as it were, of that tripartite board. But of course, needs also include those technical needs that you look for in a board member, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in just a few slides about some of the things that you should be looking for. Also, you want to consider the attributes of a board member. So do you have a document that lists the types of folks that you're looking for on your board? What has your agency done when it comes to thinking about who it's reaching out to and who it's looking for? So obviously, attributes would be folks who have the ability to serve on the board, folks who are able to meet the needs of the agency, folks who can contribute from their various sectors or their parts of that tripartite structure. And also folks who are committed to the mission of community action. I think that's one of the most important attributes of a board member. Of course, next you're looking for board members who have an interest in the mission, values, and overall interest of community action. You want to recruit board members who are aligned with what community action is trying to do. Of course, fight poverty in your community, and of course, the mission of your agency. When you're looking at board recruitment, you also want to make sure you're setting expectations. So, for example, do you have a job description of what the requirements are of serving on the board? You want to make sure that when you get those new board members, they come in and get seated already knowing what's expected of them, the requirements, how much time that they'll have to be volunteering, and the other duties that are expected of a community action board member. And I think that's really important because community action boards play a much stronger role with their agencies compared to your average nonprofit board. So you want to make sure that you're recruiting board members who know what those expectations are and can fulfill them and be good, productive board members for your agency. And lastly, you want someone who is committed to the agency, committed to the mission of community action, and will hopefully continue to serve and be a real support to your agency. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about each of these elements right now. So at the top, key skills for board members. So, one of the ways that you can think about recruiting your board is it's almost like your draft for your sports team. You are looking to fill those key needs by recruiting board members who provide those skills for your agency. And of course, as I mentioned, that tripartite structure is crucially important. You want to make sure that you're recruiting board members who keep your board in compliance with the three different sectors that you're representing on your board. But of course, this slide goes through some of the other skills that you might want to recruit for when you're looking at those board members. So obviously, you want board members, at least one or two that have that deeper financial background. Folks who might have been CPAs or who are currently CPAs, CFOs, folks who have a business process background and a background in grants management. It's often helpful to have somebody with a legal background on your board. It doesn't always have to be a lawyer. You can have somebody who's a paralegal or who is simply familiar with the legal issues, the legal environment that your agency operates in. But that is a crucially important skill set. Fundraising is another set of skills to consider. I know community action boards probably do a little bit less fundraising than your typical nonprofit board because most of our agencies are funded through the provision of direct services. So unlike sort of your typical nonprofit, there's a little bit less need for fundraising, but many agencies do have that fundraising committee. So you want to look potentially at board members who have connections to community foundations, maybe who have a background in fundraising or development, folks who have a background as event planners, especially if your agency, does a number of community events or fundraising events. So you're looking for that broad range of experience and expertise in helping your agency do overall fund development. Of course, board members who have a background in administration is especially helpful. So folks who have that experience on a leadership team at another organization, your CEOs, your COOs, chief operating officers, and of course, folks who have HR, human resources backgrounds are always extremely helpful. And I think, some of these technical backgrounds are especially important if you have a smaller agency. Maybe you have someone who serves as both your chief operating officer and the head of your HR. Who maybe doesn't have a lot of background formally as an HR director. If that's the case, you would definitely want to recruit a board member, who can be a mentor to them, who has that more formal background in HR. And of course, as you look around your agency, look for those opportunities to backstop staff, who might be wearing multiple hats or who might need to be mentored because maybe they're just coming on in their particular role. Of course, you would want board members who have a research background to help with things like your needs assessment or your strategic planning process. So board members that have PhDs, maybe a connection to the local college and university. And of course, board members who would have backgrounds in quality improvement and performance management. Again, board members who can help you look and analyze the data that you collect and can support your implementation of that Roma framework and ensure your agency is engaging in continuous improvement. And of course, you want board members with some background or connections around advocacy and outreach. And I think this is really important to stress. Your community action agency board is the voice of your community. So you want those board members who aren't just representative of the different sectors that you engage. You want folks who ideally are able to represent those sectors. So you want folks who are connected to other networks, other organizations, who can provide that formal connection to really make sure that your board is connected to the broader community that you serve, you engage with, and that you collaborate with. So again, when you're thinking through who you're selecting for your board, you want to make sure that you have a very clear sense of what the needs of your agency are and that you're consciously recruiting those board members to fill those needs. You don't ever just simply want to be filling a slot to fill a slot. You always want to be thinking about who you're going to recruit, what are those, especially those technical needs that your agency can benefit from. There are a couple of really helpful resources that can assist you in going through this process. One is available from BoardSource, and BoardSource is a national organization that provides a lot of training and technical assistance around board issues, and they have a free board recruitment matrix. It's just a very helpful tool that walks through who's on your board, what kind of skills and abilities you need, when are you going to be replacing those board members. And there's also a resource, a similar resource developed by CAPLaw that's available from the CAPLaw website. And if you haven't taken a look at this particular resource, it's very straightforward. It's just a one-page document that helps you map out who's on your board, what skills they bring, what part of the tripartite structure they represent. But it is, I think, an invaluable planning document because it really forces you to look at the big picture. What kind of skills and abilities and strengths might be missing from your board, and how can you be strategic as you're thinking about your long-term board recruitment strategy to make sure that you're looking at how you can fill those slots in a way that really builds the capacity of your agency. So if you don't have a tool like this, maybe you're using something that you've developed in-house or maybe from a consultant. But if you don't have that tool that lays out who's on your board, what sectors they represent, what skills and resources they bring, when is their term over, so you can engage in that long-term recruitment, would strongly suggest that your agency just download the CAPLaw or the BoardSource tool to really help think through that process. So a couple more tips for that board selection procedure. One of the things I'll talk about in just a little bit is using a board committee. So, we strongly suggest that you have a board development or governance committee. I'll talk a little bit more about the roles and responsibilities of that committee, but I think And a lot of times when I do board trainings with agencies, folks will say, well, you know, we don't have a governance or a board development committee, but we do have some other committees that deal with those issues, that are looking at board recruitment, that look at board training. And, you know, for me, I think it's important enough to make sure that you're building the capacity of your board, that you have that long-term recruitment strategy in place. You know, it's helpful to have a separate committee that's responsible for those roles that I'll talk about in just a few slides, but that's one of the things to check in on: who on your board is responsible for making sure board development occurs on a regular basis. As we've just been talking, make sure that you're recruiting smartly and strategically. I still hear, you know, way too many stories of agencies that are scrambling for board members because somebody has resigned unexpectedly, or they're not sure who their next board member is to fill an open seat. So that's why it's so crucially important to have that board succession plan in place, not just for your board chair, but for, you know, all your key board committee chairs, and I think your board as a whole. You really want to make sure that you know who your next board members are before those slots come open, and so you're recruiting proactively. You've got that list of, you know, the next 10 potential board members all ready to go, so you're not caught flat-footed when you need to fill a seat on your board. Another suggestion is to require applications, and CAAs has some helpful resources on this, but I think that's just a way to do some basic screening of board members, make sure also that the board member is aware of the duties and responsibilities of the board, but requiring applications is just also a way to make sure that somebody's committed and to get that basic information and background on them. And of course, a reminder to follow your selection procedures. So I'll show you in just a little bit some additional resources available from CAAs on reviewing your bylaws that's part of your selection process. But again, it's just good to revisit to make sure the way you're selecting board members is working for your agency. So I'll stop here, see if there are any questions from folks. All right, and it looks like Courtney is also putting in helpful information in the chat, registration for our upcoming webinars, but again, please feel more than free to put those questions in the chat box as we go along. All right, so let's do a little bit of a deeper dive on that governance or board development committee. So, you know, it's not absolutely essential that you have a completely separate board governance and development committee, but I do always suggest it to our agencies, you know, especially if you have a larger board, or conversely, if you're a smaller agency and you might need a little bit of extra help in managing your board, having a committee that has that specific responsibility detailed, I think is really, really helpful. So, of course, if you don't have one, you know, one thing you can just simply do is see, are there other committees, other board members who have these responsibilities that I'm about to talk about? And if you don't, I think it is just good practice to at least think through, if you don't have one, whether your agency should create a board governance or development committee that's responsible for the recruitment, the retention, and the development of your board. So, of course, at the very top of the list, this type of committee oversees processes for selecting board members and filling vacancies. So they would be the committee that would fill out that CAAs tool that I was talking about and make sure there's that long-term recruitment strategy in place. Also, it is typically a standing committee, so it would meet throughout the year, not just before board elections, because of course you should always be engaging in board development. You should always be recruiting new board members. You should always be providing board training. Those are some of the primary roles that the governance or development committee would fill. And you see there at the bottom of the screen some additional tasks that this committee typically takes on. So they're the ones who work with your executive director or CEO to make sure that the board is functioning well, so they typically do the board assessment and just have those check-in conversations with the CEO or ED to make sure things are running smoothly. They also coordinate board orientation and training. I think it's really important to make sure that you're engaging your board about what they want to be trained on, but also educating them a little bit about what those different training topics are. You know, some folks that sit on community action boards might not have ever worked with a board before, and so if you ask them what their training needs are, they might not necessarily know. So part of what your governance or board development committee would do is work with your board, talk about what kind of training topics are out there, and then build out that training plan for your board on an annual basis. And so again, that's where those CAP law tools really come into play. They provide you with those out-of-the-box training resources to help you go through that process and also provide that training to your board. Another responsibility of this committee typically is to implement that self-assessment process. We'll talk about board assessment in a subsequent webinar, and we'll go through some of the tools and resources that are out there, but I think it's really important to do that assessment. It's usually done on an annual basis, but that way you make sure that you're getting feedback from your board, finding out what your board thinks its needs are, and what you as an agency can do to improve and continue to develop your board over time. And of course, the Board Governance or Development Committee coordinates with periodic review of those governing documents, especially your bylaws, making sure that you're looking at whether your selection procedure is working, making sure that you're in compliance with your tripartite board structure, and those basic responsibilities to make sure your board is structured properly and functioning effectively. So again, as we go through what a board development or governance committee typically does, ask yourself, even if you don't have one of those committees, do you have other committees that are playing these roles? And if not, again, I would encourage you to think about creating a committee, because again, these are roles and responsibilities of your board that are crucially important. So a note on bylaws, as I just mentioned, one of the things the Governance and Development Committee typically does is review your bylaws from time to time. So there is a great toolkit available from CAP Law called The Rules Community Action Agencies Live By, and it goes through some options for making sure that your bylaws are flexible, especially when it comes to the recruitment and selection of new board members. So it gives you some helpful tips for working with your bylaws and also making sure that you're following the procedures outlined in your bylaws, especially around the recruitment and selection of your new board members. And it's also a great check that your bylaws reflect those grant requirements, as I mentioned, for board composition and selection. So just a helpful resource out there. So if you haven't taken a look at this particular resource, make sure you download it and make sure your board knows about these resources available from CAP Law. Always good practice to make sure your board has at least taken a look at that CAP Law website, because they do have, I think the primary toolbox of resources available for your board members. And just a reminder that Standard 5.3 of the organizational standards asks that your bylaws have been reviewed by an attorney within the past 5 years. Of course, that's not applicable to a public agency, but for our private agencies, our nonprofits, just a reminder to make sure that you're working with an attorney, and that would be another thing that your Board Governance and Development Committee would probably be involved with. And for Standard 5.4, that your organization or department, if you're a public agency, documents that each board member has received a copy of the bylaws within the past 2 years. So this is another example of one of the things that Board Governance or Development Committee would be responsible for, and that also helps make sure that your board is engaged with helping your agency meet the organizational standards, and also, if the board is helping with this, it just reduces the burden a little bit of tracking that documentation if there's a board committee that's responsible for making sure these things get documented. So now I want to talk about some of the strategies for recruitment and succession planning. And again, this is one of the things that your Board Governance and Development Committee would talk about. You would want to make sure that you've got these strategies in place for getting that next group of board members seated. And so I just want to go through some common strategies that I've seen used by other community action agencies, and hopefully there'll be a few things in here that you might not have thought of, or maybe that your board can revisit. So at the top of the list, one of the things I hear from agencies is one of the most challenging parts of that tripartite structure to fill are your board members with low income. So one of the things you can do to help address that is encourage staff and board members to identify your customers who might be able and willing to serve. Your customer base is hopefully one of your best potential sources of new board members. So your program managers, your frontline staff should always be on the lookout for those customers who might make good board members, ones who are familiar with your agency, with your programs and services, especially customers who have connections to other organizations and institutions within the neighborhoods and the communities that you work with. So really your program managers, your frontline staff should be your eyes and ears for potentially recruiting those new board members and communicating to your customers that there might be a board seat coming open. That's also a great opportunity for one of your customers who's looking to add to their resume, make other connections, or even a customer who's maybe been with your agency for a couple of years, maybe has taken that next step to self-sufficiency, but still is living in the neighborhood or the community that you're primarily serving. Another suggestion is invite prospective board members to serve in an advisory capacity to the board and or a board committee. So again, a lot of folks, not just from your customers, but from other sectors of the community might not have served on a board before. So this is a great way to vet prospective board members, also make sure that they get a chance to see the board in operation, learn a little bit more about what a board does. So if there are those opportunities, and this requires some level of intentionality, identifying those folks who you might want to invite to join the board, and then looking for those opportunities to bring them in to sit in on a board meeting or to sit in on a committee meeting so they get a better sense of what your agency does and whether they're a fit for the board and vice versa. Another suggestion is build those connections to other public, nonprofit, and private service providers. And this is a potential source for all three of those tripartite legs of your board. So in the same way, your program managers and frontline staff should be recruiting potential board members. You can ask your other partners, folks that you might have referral agreements with, that you might serve as part of a coalition or collaborative. Their customers might be potential board members and help fill that requirement that 1/3 or more of your board come from communities and individuals with low incomes, but also from other sectors. This is a great way to maybe fill folks or fill board slots with skills that you might not have at your agency. So, recruiting board members from other organizations that you work with in the community is a great way to build those connections. And, maybe if there's a star fundraiser at another organization and you really need some help with fundraising, inviting them to sit on your board would be a great way to make sure that you hopefully cultivate those relationships and get some of that expertise on your board. Another suggestion is identify other advisory bodies, committees, and commissions to engage. So many communities have those citizen bodies, those advisory groups. That is a great place to pull additional folks for your board from, because those are most likely individuals or members of other organizations that have those connections to other sectors that can really be great resources for your board. So that should be a fertile ground for recruitment, any advisory bodies, any citizens commissions. So try to cast that broad net and look for folks who are engaged more broadly in the community, but also probably have some of those skills and abilities that you'd want to recruit to be on your board. Those are really great sources of folks who are probably more civic-minded, who have some experience serving in that advisory capacity, who could potentially make good board members. Another way to recruit board members is to hold a community forum. So, I'm a big fan of having community action agencies, just at least once a year, invite members of the community. And this is a great opportunity to talk about what you're doing as an agency, talk about your needs assessment, release your outcome data for the year, your annual report as an agency. But it's also a great opportunity to recruit those potential board members. So you can talk about potential upcoming vacancies on your board, talk a little bit more about what's expected of your board members, what kind of roles they play, and what some of the rewards of serving on your board are. So that annual community meeting is that great opportunity to do that recruitment and make sure that you're developing that pipeline to the communities that you serve. Another great suggestion that I've seen some agencies do is offer leadership and community organizing training for your customers and neighborhood residents. This is something that we haven't seen as much of. A lot of agencies, still focus on providing those direct services, but if there's an opportunity to do some leadership training, some community organizing training with your customers or the communities that you serve, that's a great way to build the capacity of potential board members and also recruit potential board members as part of that training. So always be thinking of those ways that you can sort of get a jump on that recruitment process, but also, these types of trainings typically, tend to attract folks that are a little bit more committed, a little bit more interested in serving, and working with the board provides them, with that next step once they've gone through that training process. But it's a great way to vet people and make sure, again, that you're keeping that pipeline of new board members coming. Next, make sure that you've got a social media strategy for publicizing opportunities. So, if you know that there's going to be a board opening, 3 months down the road, you should start recruiting early. So use your Facebook page, use your Twitter, and say, we've got an application available for download. If you're interested in serving on our board, here are some of the basic roles and responsibilities and requirements. So make sure you're getting that information out. Don't wait for those potential board members to come to you. Be proactive and make sure that you're recruiting from those different sectors and using your social media and other communications outlets to be proactive and recruit those board members. Another suggestion is recruit from those natural constituencies out there. So, for example, your Head Start parents, if you have a Head Start program, and conversely, if you don't operate a Head Start program, going to the nearest Head Start program is a great place to recruit potential board members from, especially those low-income representatives, because that overlaps with who is on that policy council for those Head Start programs. Also, parent-teacher associations from school districts, that's a great way to forge those relationships with your local school system. And also, if there's a school district that has a set of schools that predominantly serves the low-income community, that's also a great way to connect somebody, who in turn has that connection with other folks in the community that you serve through that PTA, or similar body, but also is able to fill those roles and those requirements of that tripartite structure. And of course, things like neighborhood associations, civic groups, tenants organizations, all those either formal or quasi-formal bodies that can provide you with connections from folks in the communities that you serve that can also help connect you with their broader membership. That's a great way, again, to make sure that you're not just recruiting board members who represent the communities that you serve, but who are also have those formal connections with those other organizations, with those other bodies that can continue to build out those relationships with your community. All right, and lastly, again, just a reminder, use that standing board development committee to make sure you're actively and continuously overseeing recruitment. So, for example, tasking every board member to have the name of their potential replacement or another person who can serve on the board. That's one of the things that the committee does, is making sure the board is out there actively recruiting potential new board members. And again, that board committee anticipates vacancies through succession planning. So that cap law tool that I showed you a little bit earlier, again, make sure that you're listing out when folks' terms are up, so you can always be looking forward, 3 months, 6 months out, knowing when you're going to have to recruit those new board members. And of course, this committee stays on top of board needs, make sure that you're recruiting folks with the skills that your agency needs. And again, that's why I say, even if you've got other committees already in place that deal with some of these issues, I think it's important enough, to consider having a board governance or development committee so you can make sure that there's one place on your board that clearly has the responsibility for continuing to build your board's capacity and have that overall strategy in place to reach out to potential new board members and make sure that you've got those pipelines to those other sectors of the community open. So I'm going to stop for a second and see if there are any questions that have come in. All right, and it looks like no questions at the moment, so we'll continue. So again, this slide just reiterates the basic and for me one of the most fundamental requirements of a community action board, making sure that you've got that tripartite structure in place. We'll talk in a little bit more detail about focusing in on the low-income sector, making sure that you are recruiting new board members from those communities that you serve. But again, just a reminder to make sure that you are meeting those requirements of the CSBG Act, that you have at least 1/3 of your representatives from the low-income sector, 1/3 from elected or public officials, and the remainder from other sectors of your community. And so, it's that last sector that I think, you're often trying to recruit for those skills and abilities, things like, lawyers and CPAs who may not fall into those other sectors. And so, that's part of having that big picture board development and recruitment strategy in place. You're being strategic within that tripartite framework of recruiting folks who also meet those other needs. So you're looking for, customers who might, for example, have skills and abilities that your agencies can use, or you're looking for elected officials who might be able to provide you with some of those, maybe connections to folks with additional skills and resources, and of course from that broader set of sectors that you can recruit that last tripartite leg of your board from, that you're really casting that broad net, looking at those other sectors, the business sector, the faith community, the education sector in your community, and you're really thinking about those broader long-term needs that you're going to fill through your board recruitment strategy. All right, so let's focus in a little bit more on recruitment for your board members with low incomes. I think this is often where agencies run into some challenges. So just some quick reminders that your representatives from the low-income sector must be democratically selected to assure that they are representative of low-income or people with low incomes in your service area. I'll talk in a little bit more detail in just a second about what those requirements are for democratic selection. And of course, a reminder that if they are formally chosen to represent a particular neighborhood, they must live there. But again, more broadly, I think that the folks who are representative of the low-income community, again, don't necessarily have to be people with low incomes, although that is best practice. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about how to make sure that you are filling these slots correctly. So just a few reminders for our public agencies that the low-income sector representatives must be representative of low-income individuals and families in the service area. They also must live in the service area, so slightly different requirement for our public agencies, and they must be able to participate actively in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of your community services block grant program. So just some slightly different requirements for our public and our nonprofit agencies, and of course the resources on CAPLAW's webpage goes into a lot more detail about what those requirements are. So again, just to reiterate that for our nonprofit agencies, the low-income sector representatives should represent current low-income residents but don't need to be low-income themselves. However, I do want to emphasize that suggested practice from both CAPLA and the partnership is that the folks who are representing the low-income community are folks with low incomes. It is within the letter of the law for those folks to simply be representatives of the low-income community. So, for example, maybe they live in one of the communities that you serve, but are working class. They're not technically someone with low income, but they are from that community. That would be an example of someone who could still speak to the needs and interests of the communities that you're serving, but would still be able to meet that requirement. I think that then there are cases where you are recruiting folks, maybe someone from the local faith community who lives and works in the community that they serve, but are not low income themselves. And for me, that's a little bit more on the borderline. I would, if, for example, a pastor of a local church, they would be more of that third sector for me, someone from the broader community that you work with. Again, we really try to emphasize to agencies the importance of making sure that your low-income sector is really the voice of the folks that you're serving, and that means that as many as possible should ideally be people with low incomes, of course, but again with that caveat that is not the letter of the law. They can be folks who are representative of the community that you serve. So I think an important nuance to understand there, but again, I think that just underscores the importance of making sure that you are actively recruiting folks from the communities that you're working with, that you've got that pipeline, and hopefully that you're doing some advanced development so you're not scrambling for board members to represent that sector. Another common question we get is, what is a democratic selection? And, of course, there are some agencies who run open elections. They'll have a community meeting in the communities that they serve, and folks are nominated and go through a formal process. And I think that is, a great way to do democratic selection, although that does require a little bit more time, a little bit more resources. And so there are what are known as micro-democratic election procedures. So that would be working with a group whose members have already been selected, or who could select one of their members democratically to in turn serve on your board. So, for example, let's say you have a parent-teacher association that is a part of a school district that predominantly serves a low-income community. You could have the PTA select one of their members to serve on your board. So the PTA would go through that selection process, and that would qualify as democratically selected. Or, for example, if you have a neighborhood association in a community that you serve, the neighborhood association could select one of their members to sit on your board. So that would be an example of a micro-democratic selection process. You wouldn't have to go through the full process of having a community meeting, inviting folks from throughout your service area to run for your board. And the advantage there is it lets you target those organizations, those institutions that you want to have those connections from. You want to be connected with those tenant groups, those civic organizations, the parent-teacher associations, the policy councils that Head Start programs in the communities that you serve. And so this is a good way to make sure that you're connecting with those groups, you're still meeting the requirement for having that democratic selection process, but that you are doing it in a way that's procedurally maybe a little bit more manageable than having open elections across the entirety of your service area. Although again, that is a perfectly good way to do it. Some agencies just simply, I think maybe have sometimes capacity issues, especially smaller agencies, to run an election. So this is a way to make sure you're meeting the letter of the law for democratic selection, but still connecting with those groups and institutions that you want to make sure you've got strong relationships with. Also, CAPLA has a great brief on democratic selection procedures. They have case studies from how a number of agencies have worked with the democratic selection requirement. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. Provide you with some really great examples of how agencies around the country are making sure that they are drawing from the communities that they serve, complying with that democratic selection process, but doing it in a way that is really thoughtful and strategic, and making sure that they're connecting with those groups and institutions that should be represented on your board. So I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions from folks. Right, it doesn't look like there's anything, so I'm going to go on and conclude with developing effective board orientation and training. And I think this is crucially important, especially for new board members, that you have a very thoughtful process as you're going through that training and orientation process. We'll talk about broader board orientation and training in the next webinar, so I really want to focus in on that orientation for new board members, and especially the first couple of trainings you do after they are seated. So again, just to remind you, that Board Development and Governance Committee would be the structure within your board that's responsible for making sure that you've got that orientation process in place. So again, some of their responsibilities are to work with your executive director or CEO to make sure that when you're seating new board members, that they have what they need, that they're getting the orientation that's required, and they're building those relationships both with their fellow board members and the agency right out of the gate. That committee also coordinates board orientation and training, and I really want to stress the importance of making sure that you have a comprehensive approach to doing board orientation and training. This is something, especially for the orientation component, that you should sit down and take a look at, probably on an annual basis, to make sure that the orientation is working for board members, but also that you've got that annual training strategy in place. And again, that's where those CAPLA resources that I've been talking about, I think, really come into play. And of course, that Board Development Committee also works with the self-assessment process, which is a great way to make sure those new board members have that opportunity to provide you with feedback about what's working, and also what the agency can do to continue to develop the capacity of its board. Just a reminder that Standard 5.7 requires that your organization or department has that process to provide a structured orientation for your new board members within 6 months of being seated. I would say 6 months is the absolute longest a new board member should go without getting that training. Suggested practice is to make sure that new board members get that orientation as soon as possible, just because you really want to make sure they understand their roles and responsibilities right out of the gate. And of course, Standard 5.8 requires that board members have been provided with training on their duties and responsibilities within the past 2 years. And that's why it's important to have that overall strategy for board training, that a committee, or at least a couple of individuals on the board have sat down, thought about what you're going to train your board on over the course of, probably the next year or two. I don't think 2 years is, necessarily too far in the future to have that training strategy. You really want to make sure that you're covering those high priority training topics. And, I still hear, far too many boards when I say, what is your approach to doing board training, it's still catch as catch can, that maybe folks suggest a topic for the next meeting at the end of the last one, or maybe you're doing training more episodically. I really think suggested practice is to have all the board training topics mapped out well in advance, so you can make sure that you're training on those high priority topics, and your board is getting the training on those issues it needs to be a high functioning and effective board. So on the screen are just some suggestions for what topics that you would want to cover in that board orientation, and of course those longer-term trainings that you'll do over the course of the year. So I won't go through each of these topics, but I think this is a good checklist. So what you can do is take this slide and compare it to what you're providing your board in terms of orientation and seeing, you know, are you ticking off all these boxes? These are really the high priority topics that board members, you know, I think should be getting training on. So it's just a good point of comparison. And of course, those cap law resources that I mentioned, that board training toolkit, provide you with the slides to make sure your board is getting training on these topics. So I want to go through a couple of these just to connect you with additional resources to make sure you know what's out there to support your board as it's doing its training. So for the second topic on that list, history, the Community Action Agency Leaders Legal Guide has in Chapter 2 slides and resources on the history of community action. It's got fact sheets, a brief written history, so you want to make sure that you're providing the basics of who we are as community action, both the history of our broader movement and also of your agency. So other things to include in this section, you know, would be the map of your board structure, any brochures that describe, you know, the programs and services provided by your agency, any newsletters that can provide a little bit of the history of, you know, what you've been working on as an agency. And again, you want to make sure that new board members understand who your agency is and who community action is. For strategic direction, the fourth thing that you would want to make sure that you're orienting new board members on, of course, you would want to make sure that they have a copy of your agency's strategic plan and have an opportunity to discuss it, that they know who sits on the board planning committee, and of course the partnership has a guide to strategic planning that's helpful to include in that new board member orientation packet, just to talk a little, you know, just to provide that additional background on strategic planning and what strategic planning means in the community action context. The fifth topic, and I think this is a crucially important one, is financial oversight. You really want to make sure that your board members understand their roles and responsibilities in terms of especially their fiduciary responsibility, reviewing your agency financial data, your audit findings, those nuts and bolts. So Cap Law has a great publication called Tools for Top-Notch CAAs, a practical approach to governance and financial excellence. And as you can see up on the screen, a number of the sections in those guides provide you with additional resources that you would want to provide to board members, or at least provide training on for those new board members. So make sure you're really taking advantage of those Cap Law resources. You should be drawing a lot of your board orientation materials from those existing resources that Cap Law has. Another topic you want to make sure you cover is that organizational structure. So make sure that you've got that organizational chart in the orientation. You want to make sure your board members understand the structure of the agency and also the structure of the board. They should know, you know, who you're at a minimum, who the members of your leadership team are, you know, providing those bios, and also some discussion of the relationship between the board and especially the executive and CEO, but also the staff as well. You also want to have that training on board composition. So again, doing a little bit of a deeper dive about things like the tripartite structure. This is where you would introduce new board members to other folks on the board. So in the board orientation packet, you would have things like board member bios, so they've got a chance to read a little bit about who else is on the board. You would want to include the board bylaws and also governance policies and procedures, so sort of the nuts and bolts of the board. And of course, you would want to have that opportunity to do that back and forth. You know, don't just hand these materials out because, you know, these are very technical documents. You want someone to actually be training the new board members in what this material actually means. Of course, you want to, especially for new board members, at least have the basics of their roles and responsibilities. We suggest that boards have a formal job description. So, what is it that's expected and required of board members? A review of their fiduciary duties, D&O insurance, and of course, those other basic responsibilities. So, of course, CAAs has some existing resources, and that slide deck, the toolkit that I mentioned, has a section on training new board members on roles and responsibilities. So we're really trying to make sure that the materials that are needed for doing a good board orientation are as easy to access as possible. And of course, you would want to cover the operations of your agency and your board. So make sure that you're pulling from those CAAs resources. Again, Tools for Top-Notch CAAs is a great basic resource that provides a lot of the information that you would want to include in that orientation. And of course, make sure that you're providing that in turn to your board members as part of that orientation process. So just a couple more slides to go. Up on the screen are just some examples for how you go through orientation and training. The partnership provides a wide range of webinars, and CAAs does as well on its website. So those are great sort of at-will resources that board members can download and use to educate themselves at their leisure. Make sure that you're using all those CAAs training modules. And I'm also a big fan of those one-on-one meetings, especially for new board members. So make sure when you're planning out how you do orientation, for new board members, you're taking advantage of all the resources that are out there and thinking through a number of different modalities. As part of the orientation, just don't hand the board members these materials. Make sure you set aside enough time. Make sure there are a couple other board members there who can serve as mentors, who can talk to those new board members, and make sure that you're doing effective follow-up, as I mentioned, in that longer-term annual training strategy that you have for your board. And again, just a reminder that you've got, again, that regular board training in place and that you're thinking long-term, that you're mapping out your board training strategy as part of your annual board development activity. Don't do it as sort of a catch-as-catch-can process where you're thinking about what you're doing at the next board meeting at the end of the current board meeting. You really want your board training mapped out for the whole year so you can really be thoughtful and strategic about how you're building the capacity of your board. Just a reminder that CAAs also has a board self-training tool. This is also a great thing to give new board members, but it does provide more resources, again, trying to make it as easy as possible, putting those resources into the hands of our agency to do ongoing board development. So if you haven't looked at those CAAs resources or maybe haven't revisited them in a while, make sure that you've really taken a look at all the resources that are available to you. And of course, as I mentioned, the partnership does have a growing number of YouTube videos specifically for our board members. I mentioned those Roma for Board training webinars that should be out within the next week or so. And we'll also continue to add to that content, making it easy as possible for board members, especially new board members, to access those tools and resources. So finally, just a couple of ideas to leave you with on building the capacity for new board members. Make sure that your new board members have a mentor from your board. I think this is one of the best things you can do, someone who can answer their questions, get them oriented, and really give them the lay of the land and be that one-on-one peer that they can talk to. Another suggestion is make sure new board members identify specific areas of interest that they have and associated committee assignments. Making sure they're connected with a committee as soon as possible helps engage them right out of the gate and make sure that they're hopefully connecting with particular committees that are connected to their interests. Also make sure that new board members connect with the mission of your agency and community action. So as part of that orientation, have that review of your agency's mission and the history of community action so they know that they're not just connected with your agency, they're part of a broader anti-poverty movement that's been around since 1964. I think that's very powerful for new board members to connect with the broader history of our field. Another suggestion, conduct a personal site visit to the agency. I think that's good for all board members, on an annual basis to go see, one of your program sites or connect with, your Head Start program. But especially for new board members, it's a great way, to make what your agency does real, to really connect and show the board member, what you're doing and the importance of your work. I think it's also really important to connect with the executive director and CEO. So at that orientation, I think having your ED and CEO there to make sure that they can answer the questions of the new board members and make that personal connection as soon as possible. And then lastly, prioritize new board members for attendance at conferences and other trainings. Be proactive about looking for those opportunities to engage them, get them up to speed, and I think that can also be a real fun experience for a new board member going to that state association conference, or if you have the resources, a regional or a national conference. So that concludes our webinar for today. Again, remember, we've got 2 more webinars coming up in the series on board development, so I hope you tune in to those, and you can access the recording for this webinar on the partnership website along with the slides. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Always happy to connect you with the resources that I mentioned, and otherwise make sure that your agency has a strong, effective, and high-functioning board. So thank you for tuning in this afternoon, and hope to see you on the next webinar.